The Black Widow pulled the drowning native boy from the Powder River as thunder split the Wyoming sky above them. Her calloused hands locked around his wrist while the current fought to drag them both under. The water was ice and fury, and her black mourning dress billowed around her like death itself. She didn't know his name. She didn't know his tribe. She only knew he was dying. The boy's dark eyes fluttered. For one terrifying moment, she saw another face in the churning water. Her son's face from that horrible night 3 years ago. The memory hit like a physical blow, but she pushed it down. There was only this moment. Only this child who needed to live. Abigail Morgan hauled him to shore with strength born of grief and determination. The boy coughed up river water, his small body shaking against the muddy bank. She cradled him and performed the breath-of-life technique her late husband, Joel, had taught her during their early days on the frontier. Breathe, press, breathe, press. The boy's chest rose and fell. His eyes opened, focusing on her face with a clarity that seemed too old for his years. He whispered one word before consciousness left him again. Dakota. As she lifted him, something caught her attention. The intricate beadwork on his vest contained symbols from multiple tribes. Some of them were sworn enemies. The Lakota Thunderbird sat next to the Cheyenne Morning Star. Crow horse designs intertwined with Arapaho geometric patterns. It was impossible. No child would wear such a thing unless he belonged to all of them somehow. He clutched a medicine bag that seemed far too important for someone so young. The leather was worn smooth by countless hands, and the sacred symbols burned into its surface spoke of ceremonies she couldn't understand. Abigail carried him toward her modest cabin, each step heavy with questions she couldn't answer. The storm followed them, rain hammering the roof as she laid him on her narrow bed. She built up the fire and began the work of keeping him alive. Through the long night, she tended his fever with her herbal knowledge. Willow bark for the pain, echinacea for strength, sage for purification. Skills learned from necessity when the nearest doctor was 100 miles away, and help was something you provided for yourself. The boy stirred fitfully, speaking in his sleep. She caught fragments in different tribal languages. Lakota words mixed with Cheyenne phrases. Crow expressions followed by Arapaho warnings. It was as if 7 different nations lived inside his dreams. 7 fathers, he whispered. The bridge breaks. War comes with the thunder. Abigail had learned some Lakota from trading with peaceful bands over the years. Enough to understand that this child was speaking of things far beyond his age. Politics. War. The fragile peace that held the territory together through mutual exhaustion rather than mutual respect. She talked to the ghosts as she worked, her husband's voice in the whisper of wind through the cabin walls, her son's laughter in the crackle of the fire. They had been her only companions for 3 years, ever since the raiders came and took everything that mattered. The black dress she wore had become her armor, a declaration to the world that she was finished with hope, finished with caring, finished with the vulnerability that led to loss. She was the Black Widow now. Not because she killed husbands, but because she wore her grief like a warning to anyone who might try to get close. But this boy troubled her beyond his mysterious origins. When he looked at her with those knowing eyes, she felt like he was seeing straight through to her carefully buried pain. There was recognition there, and guilt. The kind of guilt that came from witnessing something terrible and living with the weight of it. Dawn broke with a sound she had never heard before. Horses, hundreds of them, moving in coordinated columns across the prairie toward her isolated cabin. She grabbed her Winchester and moved to the window, expecting to see cavalry or raiders or some other threat from her past. Instead, she saw the impossible. 7 columns of warriors from different tribes converged on her home. The proud Lakota with their painted horses and eagle feathers. The fierce Cheyenne with their distinctive war bonnets and decorated shields. The noble Crow with their elaborate hair ornaments and beaded clothing. The independent Arapaho with their geometric designs and ceremonial pipes. The skilled Kiowa with their tipi rings and painted buffalo robes. The resilient Pawnee with their roach headdresses and sacred bundles. The wise Shoshone with their intricate basketwork and silver jewelry. Natural enemies riding side by side. In an unprecedented gathering, warriors who had spent generations killing each other now moving in perfect formation toward her door. The sight defied everything she understood about tribal politics and territorial hatred. At the head of the procession rode a dignified woman with chief's markings on her clothing. She dismounted and approached with gifts, horses, weapons, furs, sacred objects that represented wealth beyond measure in this harsh land. Abigail's first instinct was to barricade the door and prepare for siege. She had seen enough violence to know that large groups of armed men rarely brought good news to isolated cabins. But something in the woman's bearing suggested ceremony rather than warfare. Behind her, Dakota stirred and sat up in bed. His fever had broken, and his eyes were clear. He looked at her with that same knowing expression, then toward the window where the tribal gathering waited. "They came," he said simply. "They came for you, Winona." The word hit her like a physical blow. Winona, firstborn daughter. A name of respect and belonging that no one had used for her in years. How did this boy know to call her that? How did he know anything about her at all? She looked from the child to the assembled warriors outside. 7 tribes united. A boy who belonged to all of them somehow. Gifts that spoke of gratitude beyond measure. And underneath it all, the growing certainty that her carefully constructed isolation was about to shatter. The world she had tried so hard to escape had found her. And it had come bearing gifts she didn't understand for a service she didn't remember providing. Abigail Morgan took a deep breath and stepped toward the door. Whatever waited outside would change everything. She could feel it in the way the boy watched her, in the patient silence of the mounted warriors, in the way the morning light fell across the threshold like a bridge between two worlds. Her hand touched the door handle. The choice was hers. Stay hidden behind grief and black cloth, or step forward into whatever this strange gift might mean. She opened the door and stepped into the light. The woman with chief's markings approached with careful steps. Her hands remained visible, empty except for the ceremonial pipe she carried. Behind her, 7 tribes waited in perfect silence. The morning air held the weight of something sacred. Dakota moved to Abigail's side, his small presence somehow bridging the gap between worlds. He spoke in Lakota to the woman, then turned to translate. His voice carried wisdom that didn't belong in a child's throat. "She is Pocahontas, daughter of Red Cloud. She speaks for the 7 nations who gather here." The woman's eyes never left Abigail's face. When she spoke, her words were measured, deliberate. Each syllable carried the weight of generations. "You saved the bridge between worlds," Dakota translated. "In 3 moons, war would have consumed us all. But the bridge lives, and so hope lives." Abigail felt the ground shift beneath her feet. This boy was more than a drowning child. He was something precious enough to unite sworn enemies. Something worth risking everything to protect. The gifts spread before her cabin told a story of gratitude beyond measure. Horses with bloodlines that stretched back to Spanish conquistadors. Weapons forged by master craftsmen. Furs that represented months of hunting in dangerous territory. Sacred objects that weren't given lightly to outsiders. Pocahontas continued speaking, her voice rising and falling with the rhythm of ceremony. Dakota's translation came in fragments, each piece adding to a picture Abigail wasn't sure she wanted to see. The boy carries the blood of 7 fathers, adopted into each tribe through bonds of love and necessity. He's our bridge when the old hatreds run too deep for words. The implications hit her slowly. 7 tribes. 7 different chiefs who claimed this child as family. 7 nations that would go to war if he died, or unite if he lived. No wonder. Someone had tried to drown him. No wonder these warriors had come bearing gifts. But bridges can be burned, Dakota added, his young voice heavy with knowledge. Someone feeds poison to the 7 nations. Whispers that turn brother against brother. The bridge must walk between them all and speak the truth that stops the war. Abigail's hands tightened on her rifle. She understood now. This wasn't gratitude. This was recruitment. They wanted her to guard this boy while he traveled between enemy camps, carrying whatever message was supposed to prevent a war that seemed inevitable. "I didn't ask for this," she said to the assembled warriors. Her voice carried across the silent morning, sharp with the authority of someone who had learned to survive alone. Dakota translated her words, then spoke again in Lakota. The exchange went on for several minutes, voices rising and falling in debate. Finally, the boy turned back to her. "They know you didn't ask, but the river gave you the choice when it gave you the bridge. You can let him drown in the wars that come, or you can help him reach the other side." Movement on the eastern hills caught her attention, smoke signals rising in coordinated patterns. Military signals, the kind that meant cavalry was moving across the territory with specific orders. A new rider approached from the tree line. Mixed blood, carrying himself with the easy confidence of someone who belonged to multiple worlds. He dismounted and approached with the careful neutrality of a man who had learned to survive by reading situations quickly. "Name's Logan," he said, his voice carrying the accent of someone educated back east. "Army Scout. Came to warn you about what's heading this way." Pocahontas stiffened at the mention of the army. The warriors behind her shifted in their saddles, hands moving closer to weapons. The fragile peace of the morning balanced on a knife's edge. "Colonel Dutch van der Berk," Logan continued. 3 days' ride east with 2 companies of cavalry. Orders to pacify the territory by any means necessary. Abigail felt the familiar cold settle in her stomach. She had heard that name before, whispered in trading posts and around campfires. Dutch was the kind of officer who measured success in body counts and land acquisitions. "But here's the thing," Logan added, his voice dropping to a whisper. "Dutch doesn't want peace. He wants the tribes to fight each other. Makes his job easier when there's fewer of them left to relocate." The words hung in the air like smoke from a distant fire. Abigail looked at the assembled warriors, at the boy who stood between worlds, at the gifts that represented everything these people had to offer. They were asking her to protect something precious while an army approached that wanted to destroy it. "Why me?" she asked. The question came out rougher than she intended, worn down by 3 years of isolation and grief. Dakota looked at her with those knowing eyes. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of secrets she wasn't ready to hear. "Because you know what it means to lose everything. And because I saw the night your family crossed over to the spirit world." The revelation hit her like a physical blow. This boy had witnessed her family's murder. He had been there when Joel and Ellie died. He had seen the raiders, heard the screams, watched her world burn down around her. "I was gathering herbs for my grandmother when the Bluecoats came," Dakota continued. "I saw them surround your home. I saw your husband try to fight them off. I saw your son try to run." Abigail's hands shook. The rifle felt heavy in her grip. 3 years of careful numbness cracked like ice in spring. This child knew. He had watched her family die and said nothing. He had let her live with questions that ate at her soul while he carried the answers. "They weren't raiders," she whispered. The words came out broken, desperate. "They were soldiers." Dakota nodded, his young face grave with the weight of truth. "The same soldiers who sell guns to the 7 nations. The same soldiers who whisper poison in the ears of chiefs. The same soldiers who want war so they can end it. The pieces fell into place with terrible clarity. Joel's death hadn't been random violence. It had been murder. Calculated, deliberate murder by the very people who were supposed to protect the territory. Her husband had discovered something, seen something, learned something that made him dangerous. To men who profited from chaos. Pocahontas spoke again, her voice urgent now. The smoke signals were multiplying on the eastern hills, more cavalry units moving into position. The window for safe passage was closing. She says the choice must be made now, Dakota translated. Accept the role of protector and help the bridge reach all 7 nations, or walk away and let the territory burn in war. Abigail looked at the boy who had watched her family die. At the woman who offered her a chance for purpose beyond grief. At the scout who warned of approaching danger. At the gifts that represented everything these people valued. She thought of Joel lying dead in their cabin while she was away hunting. Of Ellie, cut down trying to run for help. Of 3 years spent talking to ghosts and wearing black cloth like armor against a world that had taken everything she loved. I'll guard the boy, she said finally. Her voice carried across the silent morning, flat with the authority of someone who had nothing left to lose. But I do it for my own reasons, not yours. The decision felt like stepping off a cliff, like abandoning the safe isolation she had built around her grief. But there was something in Dakota's eyes, something in the way he had spoken of her family, that suggested he carried guilt as heavy as her own. If this boy had answers about that night, she would get them. If protecting him meant facing the men who killed her family, she would do that too. And if the 7 nations wanted to call her their protector, they could do that as long as they understood she protected nothing but her own need for truth. The gifts were loaded onto pack horses. The warriors prepared to disperse back to their territories. The strange alliance was struck, fragile as morning frost but holding for now. Abigail went inside to gather her things. The black dress came with her, folded carefully in her pack. She wasn't ready to stop mourning, but she was ready to stop hiding. When she emerged, Dakota was waiting by the horses. He looked at her with those knowing eyes, and she saw something there she hadn't noticed before. Hope, as if her decision to protect him had lifted some burden he had carried alone. The ghosts won't rest until the truth is spoken, he said quietly. Abigail mounted her horse and looked back at the cabin where she had spent 3 years learning to live with loss. Then she looked forward, toward the territory where 7 nations waited for a bridge that might prevent or start the war that would consume them all. The boy was right. The ghosts wouldn't rest, and neither would she. The Cheyenne camp sprawled across the valley like a permanent settlement. Tipis arranged in careful patterns that spoke of generations of tradition. Children played between the lodges while women worked hides and men tended horses. The scene carried the weight of normalcy that felt fragile in the morning light. Abigail rode beside Dakota and their small escort of mixed tribal warriors. Logan shadowed them from a distance, his presence both reassuring and troubling. A scout who knew too much about army movements wasn't always a friend. The Cheyenne Council gathered in the largest teepee as word spread of their arrival. Chiefs and war leaders formed a circle around the central fire. Their faces carried the hard lines of men who had seen too much war and buried too many sons. Dakota stood before them with the poise of someone far older than his years. When he spoke, his voice carried across the lodge with ceremony and precision. The man with the yellow hair sells guns to Crow, then tells Lakota that Crow prepares for war. He sells arrows to Kiowa, then whispers to Cheyenne that Kiowa sharpens for battle. He feeds the fire from both sides. The chiefs listened with the stillness of stone. Each detail Dakota shared painted a picture of systematic manipulation, weapons appearing in enemy camps, attacks that followed patterns too convenient to be coincidence, evidence left behind that pointed fingers at traditional enemies. One chief leaned forward, his weathered face grave. The raids on our horse herds. They used Lakota arrows but fought with crow tactics. Another nodded. Our warriors found Arapaho beadwork at the site where our hunters were killed. But the tracks showed horses shod with iron. No Arapaho shoes his horses. The pattern emerged with terrible clarity. Each tribal nation had experienced mysterious raids that seemed to come from their traditional enemies. But the evidence never quite fit. Details that suggested one tribe while tactics pointed to another. Weapons that belonged to enemies, but were used in ways that didn't match their fighting styles. Abigail felt the familiar cold settle in her stomach. She had seen this before. The night Joel and Ellie died, the raiders had left behind Comanche arrows but used cavalry tactics. Tracks that suggested one thing while the violence pointed to another. "Your husband," the eldest chief said carefully, his eyes finding hers. Across the fire. He was asking questions about missing weapons, questions that made dangerous men nervous. The words hit her like a physical blow. Joel hadn't been killed by random raiders. He had been murdered because he had discovered the same pattern Dakota was describing now. The systematic manipulation of tribal conflicts by someone who profited from chaos. "He came to our camp 2 days before he died," another chief added. "Wanted to know about the weapons we had traded for. Said the numbers didn't match what the army claimed to have distributed." Abigail's hands tightened on her reins. Her husband had been investigating the weapons trading operation. He had discovered evidence of the conspiracy and been killed for it. The raiders who destroyed her family had been actors in a performance designed to cover up murder. Logan appeared at her elbow, his face grim. "We need to move." Patrol coming from the east. The escort prepared to leave with the efficiency of people who had learned to survive by staying ahead of trouble. Dakota finished his testimony with the Cheyenne Council receiving their promise to send representatives to the final gathering. As they rode toward the next camp, Logan shared intelligence that made Abigail's blood run cold. Dutch's unit isn't just any cavalry. They're pacification specialists. Their success rate comes from their willingness to manufacture the conflicts they're sent to resolve. The pieces fell into place with terrible clarity. Dutch created wars, then got promoted for ending them. The systematic manipulation of tribal conflicts wasn't just about land or resources. It was about career advancement and military contracts. Blood was just the currency that paid for ambition. "He's done this before," Logan continued. "Creates the war, then gets the glory for stopping it. Only this time, he's got bigger plans." The Crow camp received them with elaborate ceremony. Chiefs who had fought the Cheyenne for generations listened to testimony about the man who had been feeding poison to both sides. The same pattern emerged. Mysterious raids with evidence that pointed to traditional enemies. Weapons that appeared in convenient places. Attacks that followed scripts too perfect to be coincidence. As they traveled between camps, Abigail noticed that Dakota grew more troubled with each testimony. The boy who had spoken with such poise in the first councils now flinched at certain questions. His eyes carried guilt that seemed to deepen with each mile they covered. At the Arapaho camp, they were betrayed. Micah, a warrior with army-issued boots hidden beneath traditional leggings, led them into an ambush designed to look like intertribal warfare. The attack came at dawn, masked riders using cavalry tactics while carrying tribal weapons. Abigail recognized the fighting techniques immediately. These weren't tribal warriors. They were soldiers playing dress-up, staging another scene. In Dutch's long performance, the precision was too perfect. The timing too convenient. The evidence too obviously planted. She and Dakota escaped only because Logan had been watching from the ridgeline. His shots scattered the attackers before they could complete their work. But not before Abigail saw the calculated murder of innocent people staged to look like tribal violence. In the aftermath, she found a button from a cavalry uniform trampled in the mud. A spent cartridge from Army-issued ammunition. Evidence that the tribal raids had been false flag operations all along. They took shelter in a cave while Logan scouted for pursuit. The stone walls held the weight of centuries, indifferent to the human drama playing out in their shadows. Dakota sat by the small fire, his young face drawn with exhaustion and something deeper. "I was there when your family was killed," he said finally, his voice barely carried across the cave. "I saw everything. I tried to help, but I was too small. Too scared." The confession hung between them like smoke. Abigail felt the ground shift beneath her feet. This boy had watched her family die. He had been there when Joel fought the raiders. He had seen Ellie try to run for help. "I was gathering healing herbs for my grandmother when the Bluecoats came," Dakota continued. "I saw them surround your home. I saw your husband try to fight them off. I saw your son try to run." His voice broke on the last words. The guilt he had been carrying revealed itself in the set of his shoulders, the way he couldn't meet her eyes. This child had been living with the weight of witnessing her family's murder for 3 years. "I shot an arrow," he whispered. "I wounded one of them. It made them angry, made them careless. That's why you came back sooner than they expected." The revelation reframed everything. Dakota's failure to save her family had actually saved her life. His arrow had disrupted Dutch's timeline, forcing the killers to flee before they could stage the scene properly. The boy who thought he had failed had actually been the reason she survived. Logan returned with news that chilled her blood. The betrayal at the Arapaho camp had been coordinated from the inside. Someone was feeding information to Dutch about their movements. The safe passage between tribes was becoming a deadly gauntlet. "They're not just hunting the boy," Logan said. "They're hunting you too. You're the only one who can protect him long enough to get his testimony to all 7 nations." The weight of it settled on her shoulders. She wasn't just guarding a child anymore. She was protecting the key to exposing a conspiracy that reached far beyond simple weapons trading. Dutch's operation was about creating and controlling conflicts. "Across the entire frontier, we can turn back," Logan offered. "Get the boy to safety and let someone else fight this war." Abigail looked at Dakota, who was staring into the fire with the weight of too many secrets. This child had tried to save her family 3 years ago. Had carried the guilt of that night ever since. Had watched her live with questions while he held the answers. "No," she said. Her voice carried the authority of someone who had finally found something worth fighting for. "The ghosts won't rest until the truth is spoken." The decision felt like stepping across a threshold. Like abandoning the safe grief she had wrapped around herself for 3 years. But there was something in Dakota's eyes when she spoke, something that looked almost like hope. Outside the cave, the wind carried the scent of distant fires. Dutch's army was moving across the territory, leaving destruction in its wake. The window for justice was closing with each passing hour. But inside the cave, something else was building. Understanding between a woman who had lost everything and a boy who had tried to save it. Purpose that went beyond personal pain to something larger and more necessary. The hunt was on. But the hunters were about to discover that their prey had found reasons to fight back. The Kiowa camp sat in a valley that had seen too much death. Fresh graves marked the hillside where warriors had fallen in the latest raid. Women moved between the lodges with the careful silence of people who had learned that grief was a luxury they couldn't afford. Dakota delivered his testimony to the assembled chiefs with the weight of ceremony. Each word carried the authority of someone who had witnessed the machinery of war being built piece by piece. The Kiowa leaders listened with faces carved from stone, their anger building slowly behind eyes that had seen too many betrayals. The yellow-haired colonel sells weapons to your enemies, then tells you they prepare for war, Dakota said. He whispers poison in the ears of chiefs who should be brothers. He feeds the fire that consumes your children. The eldest chief nodded toward the hillside graves. The raiders who killed our young men left behind Pawnee arrows. But they rode like cavalry, fought like soldiers, left tracks that pointed in too many directions. Abigail felt the familiar pattern emerge. The same systematic deception that had killed her family. The same careful staging that made enemies of people who should have been all eyes. Dutch's operation was larger than simple weapons trading. It was the manufacturing of hatred itself. Logan appeared at the edge of the camp, his face grim with news that couldn't wait. Patrol coming from the north. Full company. They're moving fast and they know where we are. The escort prepared to leave with the efficiency of people who had learned to survive by staying ahead of trouble. But as they mounted their horses, Dakota pulled at Abigail's sleeve with the urgency of someone who could no longer carry his burden. "Alone. There's more," he whispered. "About the night your family died. About what I saw." The words hung between them like smoke from a distant fire. Abigail felt the ground shift beneath her feet. This boy had been carrying secrets for 3 years, guilt that had shaped every moment of his young life. They rode hard toward the Pawnee territory, Logan scouting ahead while their escorts watched for signs of pursuit. The land stretched endlessly under a sky that promised storms. Wind carried the scent of distant fires and the weight of approaching violence. That night, camped in a hollow that hid them from watching eyes, Dakota finally spoke the truth that had been eating at him since the river. "I was there when the Bluecoats came to your home. I saw them surround your husband. I saw your son try to run for help." His voice broke on the words. "I shot an arrow that wounded one of them. It made them angry, made them careless. That's why you came back sooner than they expected." The revelation hit her with the force of understanding. Dakota hadn't failed to save her family. He had saved her life. His arrow had disrupted Dutch's timeline, forcing the killers to flee before they could stage the scene properly. The boy who thought he had failed had actually been the reason she survived. "Your husband was asking questions about missing weapons," Dakota continued. "He had discovered the same pattern I'm telling the chiefs about now. The systematic trading of guns to enemies. The careful staging of conflicts. Dutch killed him because he was getting too close to the truth." Abigail's hands tightened on her reins. Joel hadn't been killed by random raiders. He had been murdered because he had discovered Dutch's conspiracy. The destruction of her family had been about covering up evidence of a larger crime. Logan returned with intelligence that made her blood run cold. Dutch's operation isn't just about land grabs or military advancement. He's been selling weapons to both sides of conflicts across the frontier, then using the resulting chaos to justify massive government contracts for pacification operations. The scope of the conspiracy revealed itself slowly. Dutch wasn't just a killer, he was a businessman. War was his product, and he was skilled at manufacturing it. The systematic manipulation of tribal conflicts was about profit as much as land acquisition. "He's done this in Kansas, Colorado, New Mexico," Logan continued. "Creates the war, then gets the contracts to end it. Only this time, he's got bigger plans." The most shocking revelation came when Logan revealed his true identity. Not just a scout, but an undercover investigator for the War Department's Internal Affairs Division. The government had been tracking Dutch's operations for months, but they needed testimony from someone who had witnessed the conspiracy firsthand. Dakota isn't just a symbol of peace between tribes, Logan explained. He's the only living witness to Dutch's operation who can't be dismissed as hostile testimony. A child's words carry weight that adult warriors don't. The weight of it settled on Abigail's shoulders. She wasn't just protecting a boy anymore. She was guarding the key to exposing a conspiracy that reached from the frontier to Washington itself. Dutch's operation was about creating and controlling conflicts across the entire territory. At the Pawnee camp, they found evidence of the same pattern, mysterious raids with convenient evidence. Weapons that appeared in enemy hands at precisely the right moment to justify retaliation. Attacks that followed scripts too perfect to be coincidence. The Pawnee chief spoke with the authority of someone who had buried too many warriors. The men who killed our hunters used Shoshone war paint, but they fought with cavalry tactics. Left behind evidence that pointed to our enemies, while the tracks told a different story. Dakota's testimony to the Pawnee Council revealed the full scope of Dutch's manipulation. Not just weapons trading, but the systematic creation of incidents designed to keep the tribal nations fighting each other instead of uniting against the common threat. As they prepared to leave for the final camp, Abigail faced a choice that would define everything that followed. Logan had given her Dutch's location. She could seek personal vengeance for her family's murder, or she could focus on protecting Dakota so he could testify and stop Dutch from destroying more families. The decision was complicated by the knowledge that going after Dutch personally might get them both killed. But protecting Dakota meant trusting in a justice system that had shown little concern for people who looked like her. "We can end this," Logan said quietly. "But only if the boy lives to testify before all 7 nations. Only if we can prove the conspiracy reaches beyond one corrupt colonel." Abigail looked at Dakota, who was staring into the fire with the weight of too many secrets. This child had tried to save her family 3 years ago. Had carried the guilt of that night ever since. Had watched her live with questions while he held the answers. "I choose justice," she said finally. Her voice carried the authority of someone who had found something worth living for beyond grief. "Not because I've forgiven Dutch, but because stopping him means no other family has to burn." The decision felt like stepping across a threshold, like abandoning the safe anger she had wrapped around herself for 3 years. But there was something in Dakota's eyes when she spoke, something that looked almost like relief. Outside their camp, the wind carried the scent of distant fires. Dutch's army was moving across the territory, leaving destruction in its wake. The window for justice was closing with each passing hour. But around their fire, something else was building. Understanding between a woman who had lost everything and a boy who had tried to save it. Purpose that went beyond personal pain to something larger and more necessary. The sacred ground where all 7 nations would gather was 2 days' ride away. Dutch knew they were coming. The tribal leaders were depending on Dakota's testimony to prevent the war that would consume them all. The hunt was entering its final phase. But the hunters were about to discover that their prey had found reasons to fight back that went beyond survival. They had found something worth dying for. And sometimes that was the most dangerous thing of all. The sacred ground stretched across the valley like a natural amphitheater. 7 distinct camps arranged in careful patterns that spoke of centuries of tradition. Lakota lodges faced east toward the rising sun. Cheyenne tipis formed perfect circles. Crow shelters clustered near the stream. Each nation maintained its identity while participating in something larger than any single tribe. Abigail rode beside Dakota toward the center of the gathering, her eyes scanning the unprecedented sight. Traditional enemies camping within arrow range of each other. Warriors who had spent generations killing each other, now sharing water and grazing land. The fragile peace balanced on the edge of miracle and disaster. The boy sat straighter in his saddle as they approached the ceremonial ground. His young face carried the weight of someone who understood that everything depended on the words he would speak. 7 nations had gathered to hear his testimony. The future of the territory hung in the balance. Logan met them at the edge of the central fire ring, his face grim with intelligence that couldn't wait. Dutch arrived an hour ago with 2 full companies, positioned on the ridges surrounding the valley. He's got the high ground and superior numbers. The trap was perfectly laid. The sacred ground had become a killing field. Dutch had maneuvered the 7 tribes into a position where they could be surrounded and destroyed. All he needed was an excuse to claim they were planning an uprising. He's calling it an illegal assembly, Logan continued. Says the boy was kidnapped and the tribal leaders are planning coordinated attacks on settlements. Washington believes him. Abigail felt the familiar cold settle in her stomach. Dutch's genius wasn't just in creating conflicts. It was in positioning himself as the solution to problems he had manufactured. The gathering meant to prevent war was being used to justify one. A messenger approached under a flag of truce. A young cavalry officer with the pale complexion of someone who had never seen real combat. His voice shook as he delivered Dutch's ultimatum. Colonel van der Berk demands the immediate dispersal of this illegal gathering. The kidnapped boy must be returned to proper custody. You have 1 hour to comply. The message hung in the air like smoke from a distant fire. Abigail looked at the assembled tribal leaders, at the boy who carried the truth that could expose Dutch's conspiracy, at the sacred ground that had become a battlefield. "What happens if we refuse?" she asked. The messenger's face went pale. "The colonel has orders to restore peace to the territory by any means necessary." The threat was clear: surrender or face massacre. Dutch was offering the same choice he had given her family 3 years ago. Submit to his version of justice or burn in his version of peace. After the messenger left, the tribal leaders gathered. In urgent council, chiefs who had fought each other for generations now faced a common enemy. The systematic deception that had kept them divided was revealed in all its calculated cruelty. Dakota stood before the assembled leaders with the poise of someone far older than his years. When he spoke, his voice carried across the sacred ground with the authority of witnessed truth. The yellow-haired colonel sells weapons to enemies, then whispers of war. He stages attacks that point blame at innocent tribes. He feeds poison to chiefs who should be brothers. He profits from the blood of your children. The testimony laid bare the full scope of Dutch's conspiracy. Not just weapons trading, but the systematic creation of conflicts designed to keep the tribal nations weak and divided. Each mysterious raid, each convenient piece of evidence, each whispered warning about enemy movements had been part of a calculated campaign. He killed the woman's husband because he discovered the truth, Dakota continued. He stages massacres and blames them on tribal warfare. He creates the wars he is paid to end. The chiefs listened with faces carved from stone. The pattern was clear now. Years of carefully manufactured hatred. Conflicts that had consumed their children while enriching their true enemy. The realization settled over the gathering like winter frost. Standing Bear of the Lakota spoke first. The evidence is clear. The enemy wears blue coats and speaks with forked tongue. We have been fighting each other while the real threat grows strong. Red Cloud's daughter nodded. The bridge between worlds has shown us the truth. The question now is what we do with it. The debate that followed revealed the depth of the trap Dutch had laid. Fighting would prove his claims about a hostile uprising. Surrendering would scatter them back to their territories where they could be eliminated piecemeal. Neither choice offered real survival. "There's a third path," Abigail said finally. Her voice carried across the circle with the authority of someone who had lost everything and found something worth dying for. "We make the truth too loud to ignore." Logan produced a leather satchel filled with documentation. Evidence he had been gathering for months. Financial records, weapon shipment logs, correspondence between Dutch and his government contacts. Physical proof of the conspiracy that went far beyond tribal testimony. "This reaches all the way to Washington," Logan explained. "Dutch has been selling the same solution to conflicts across the frontier. Create the war, then get the contracts. To end it, he's made himself indispensable by manufacturing the problems he's paid to solve." The plan that emerged was dangerous, but necessary. Instead of fighting or surrendering, they would make their evidence public. Send riders to every settlement, every army post, every government official who might listen. Force the truth into the open where it couldn't be buried. They'll call it lies, warned the Crow chief. The word of savages against a decorated officer. Not if the evidence comes from their own files, Logan replied. Not if the testimony is supported by documentation they can't dismiss. As the council debated, Dutch's deadline approached. The ridges around the valley bristled with cavalry weapons. The sacred ground had become a trap waiting to spring. But something had changed in the dynamic between hunter and prey. The 7 tribes were no longer divided targets. They were a united force with evidence that could destroy Dutch's entire operation. The boy who was supposed to be a victim had become a witness. The woman who was supposed to be broken had become a protector. We stand together, Sitting Bull's emissary declared. Not for war, but for justice. Not for revenge, but for truth. The decision was unanimous. The 7 tribes would make their stand on the sacred ground. Not as warriors seeking battle, but as people demanding justice. They would force the truth into the open, whatever the cost. Abigail looked at Dakota, who was watching the proceedings with eyes that carried too much wisdom for his years. This boy had tried to save her family 3 years ago. Had carried the guilt of that night ever since. Had guided her toward something larger than personal grief. You ready for this? She asked quietly. Dakota nodded, his young face grave with understanding. The ghosts won't rest until the truth is spoken, all of it. No matter what it costs. The wind picked up across the sacred ground, carrying the scent of distant storms. Dutch's army waited on the ridges, confident in their superiority and prepared for easy victory. But the people in the valley below had found something more dangerous than weapons or numbers. They had found the truth, and they had found the courage to speak it. The final confrontation was coming. But this time, the hunters would discover that their prey had become something else entirely. Something that couldn't be killed or silenced, or driven away. They had become witnesses. And witnesses, once awakened, were the most dangerous thing of all. The hour passed with the weight of ceremony. Dutch's deadline arrived on the wind that swept across the sacred ground. The ridges around. The valley bristled with cavalry weapons positioned for easy slaughter. 2 companies of soldiers waited for the order that would end the largest gathering of tribal nations in decades. Colonel Dutch van der Berk rode down from the heights with a small escort. His yellow hair caught the morning light, and his uniform bore the decorations of a man who had built his career on convenient victories. He dismounted at the edge of the ceremonial ground with the confidence of someone who had never lost a battle. "I'm here for the boy," he announced. His voice carried across the valley with the authority of someone accustomed to immediate obedience. "And to disperse this illegal gathering before it becomes a threat to innocent settlers." The assembled tribal leaders stood in formation around the central fire. 7 nations united in purpose for the first time in generations. Their silence carried more weight than any war cry ever could. They had moved beyond the need for posturing or threats. Abigail stepped forward with Dakota at her side. The boy, who had witnessed too much, carried himself with the dignity of someone who understood that words could be more powerful than weapons. His young face showed no fear, only the quiet determination of someone who had finally found the courage to speak truth. "The boy stays," Abigail said simply. Her voice carried the authority of someone who had nothing left to lose and everything to protect. "He has testimony to give about weapons trading, about false flag operations, about the systematic murder of innocent people." Dutch's expression didn't change, but something flickered behind his eyes. The confidence of a man who had controlled every variable in his carefully constructed scenarios. The realization that his prey had become something more dangerous than he had anticipated. "The word of savages against a decorated officer," Dutch replied. "Who do you think Washington will believe?" Logan emerged from the tribal council with the leather satchel that contained months of careful documentation, financial records, weapon shipment logs, correspondence between Dutch and his government contacts, evidence that went far beyond tribal testimony. "They'll believe their own files," Logan said quietly. Financial records showing weapon sales to both sides of conflicts, orders for pacification operations that were issued before the conflicts began, documentation of a conspiracy that reaches from the frontier to Washington itself. The revelation hit Dutch with visible force. His carefully constructed operation had been under investigation for months. The evidence against him was overwhelming, and came from sources he couldn't dismiss or discredit. "You're under arrest," Logan continued, producing official papers from the War Department's Internal Affairs Division, "for conspiracy, murder, and treason against the United States government." Dutch's hand moved toward his weapon, but the motion stopped as he realized the impossibility of his situation. 7 tribes surrounded him. His own army was positioned too far away to help. The evidence against him was documented and supported by witnesses who couldn't be silenced. "You have no authority here," Dutch said, but his voice carried the hollow ring of desperation. "This is still my territory, my command." "Not anymore," Logan replied. "Your command has been transferred. Your operation has been exposed. Your war is over." The moment balanced on the edge of violence. Dutch's escort fingered their weapons while the tribal warriors remained motionless. The sacred ground held its breath, waiting to see if justice would prevail or if blood would water the earth once more. Dakota stepped forward, his young voice carrying across the valley with the clarity of truth spoken without fear. "You killed her husband because he discovered your conspiracy. You staged attacks to make enemies of people who should have been allies. You sold weapons to both sides, then profited from the wars you created." The testimony laid bare the full scope of Dutch's operation, not just in this territory, but across the entire frontier. A systematic campaign of manufactured conflicts designed to enrich one man while destroying countless families. "You're done," Abigail said quietly. Her words carried the weight of 3 years of grief transformed into purpose. "Your wars are over. Your lies are exposed. Your victims will have justice." The arrest proceeded with the ceremony of justice finally served. Dutch was disarmed and restrained while his escort was ordered to stand down. The cavalry units on the ridges received new orders from their legitimate commanders. The trap that had been designed to destroy the tribal gathering became the net that caught the real criminal. In the aftermath, the 7 tribes formalized their alliance, not for war, but for mutual protection and cooperation. The systematic deception that had kept them divided was replaced by the shared understanding that their real enemies wore uniforms and spoke with forked tongues. Abigail was formally adopted into the tribal confederation as the keeper of the Cove Bridge, not just Dakota's protector, but a permanent liaison between the 7 nations and the outside world. The role came with responsibilities that would shape the rest of her life. The boy who had been drowning in the river became the symbol of unity between worlds. His testimony had prevented a war that would have consumed the territory. His courage had exposed a conspiracy that reached from the frontier to the highest levels of government. Months later, Abigail stood beside that same river where everything had begun. The water ran clear and peaceful, reflecting the sky without the turmoil of storm or flood. Dakota played with children from all 7 tribes on the banks, their laughter carrying across the valley. The black mourning dress was gone, replaced by clothing that bore beadwork from 7 different nations. Each pattern told a story of unity forged from diversity. Each symbol represented connections that transcended the boundaries that had once seemed impossible to cross. The ghosts of her family had finally found peace. Joel's investigation had led to justice. Ellie's death had meaning beyond senseless violence. The grief that had consumed her for 3 years had been transformed into something larger and more necessary. The river that had almost claimed a life had become the place where new life flourished. The bridge between worlds had held, and the connections it represented grew stronger with each passing season. In the distance, smoke rose from the fires of 7 nations living in harmony. The sound of children laughing echoed across the water. The sacred ground had become exactly what it was meant to be. A place where different peoples could come together and find common cause. The Black Widow had become the bridge keeper. The drowning boy had become the symbol of hope. The sacred ground had become the foundation for a future that honored the past while building something new. And in the space between what was lost and what was found, peace took root and grew strong. And that is all to the story for now. Please let me know where you are tuning in from. Perhaps we will create a story there. Consider liking this video and subscribing to our channel. And if you enjoy our content, click this video on your screen. I promise you, it's worth watching. See you tomorrow.